I'm going to read a couple of passages from a novel that I'm now pretty close to finishing. I've been working on for some time. Just a little bit of context before I get started. In this first section, I'm going to read you, a man has, he's a high school teacher who is at this moment separated from his wife. His adult son has come over to remonstrate with him about this situation. And this is their meeting during this time. The novel is called, for now anyway, Tell Them I Said Something. Those were Pancho Villa's last words. He was killed in a gunfight in Chihuahua, and as his lieutenant was kneeling over him, with his last breath, he said, "It can't end like this. Tell them I said something." So this is the narrator, who is a high school teacher in a Catholic boys' school, as I once was here in San Francisco at Sacred Heart. I draw somewhat on the memories of that time. And his son works with Child Protective Services and has come over to talk some sense into him. He looked down at his hands on the tabletop, one thumb nervously rubbing the other. "You should go home. Really, Dad." And what did I think of when he said that? Not what he intended. The word Dad blew me right out of the kitchen, took me back to when he was just a little boy, and I his hero. He'd call up to me from the driveway when he got home with Anne-Marie after kindergarten, or a shopping run, or a trip to the park. "Dad, Dad." And I would come to the window of the cramped room on the second floor where I prepared classes and graded papers, and wave at him, his big moon face turning red with pleasure. "There's Dad," he would shout, and keep after Anne-Marie until she too had waved up at me, waggling her fingers over an armful of groceries. Then I would blow her a kiss and turn grudgingly back to my students' papers, red pencil in hand. Oh, those papers. Essays by boys who didn't love books, most of them, and who wrote only under stern compulsion. Unreadable essays, but I read them, had to read them for duty's sake and our daily bread, jumping up to prowl the room when brought to despair by such offerings as, on Uncle Tom's Cabin, Black and White Lifestyles in the Old South, or Why I Feel Slavery is Wrong. How many essays have I read through the years? Tens of thousands. No, hundreds of thousands, and still alive to tell the tale. Now and then, to break the monotony, I've had my students write stories. That presents its own hazards. Over time, I've been treated to handwritten but word-perfect copies of The Gift of the Magi, To Build a Fire, and The Killers, among others. It's been better since the school took in girls. They've raised the game. But only last fall, 3 of the football players in my junior class turned in stories that each began with the words, "Little did I know." I decided to treat it as a joke, but I digress. On a rainy December afternoon all those years ago, my furious pacing brought me to the window, and there was George, still standing in the driveway, long after I thought he'd gone inside, gazing down at a puddle. There was a deep sag in the asphalt there. I kept meaning to complain to the landlord, but who thinks about a pothole when you're not actually banging through it? The puddle was big enough that I could see the ripples on its surface breaking into miniature combers on the far shore. George, in his shiny yellow slicker, stood pondering this body of water, head bent, hands clasped behind his back. He was, 4 or 5, and already a philosopher, and now it seemed he somehow knew how to look like one. I watched him. What was he thinking? Maybe he was mulling over one of those big questions he still trusted me to answer. Do germs have legs? Do sheep get eaten by moths? How many kids have to swim to school? Or, the time approaching Christmas, something even bigger, a needling doubt raised by some over-informed child in daycare. Is Santa Claus real? A dangerous question, this, the Santa perplex. You either reinforce your earlier complicity in the myths of the season, cheerful and innocent as they seemed at the time, or you tell the bald truth, a truth that will bring you no love or credit, as telling it will demolish a pleasant and profitable belief while revealing you as a liar for the first untruth you committed and all its corollary fictions. And it will also reveal the entire adult world as colluding in falsehood and illusion. What about the Santa cutouts on rooftops and lawns, the displays in store windows, the TV commercials and magazine ads, the wish list solemnly addressed to the North Pole? Lies? Really? Nothing but lies? Once you've bitten into that apple, you can never get the taste out of your mouth. If your mother and father and uncles and aunts and teachers and neighbors and babysitters and even strangers can all get together to fool you on this, what else are they fooling you about? Once begun, the list of possible hoaxes is endless, beginning with the jolly old elf and going on to cherubim and seraphim, the cowardice of bullies, American exceptionalism, the march of human progress, divinely inspired texts, and finally the divine inspirer himself, with plenty of casualties in between, not least the moral stature of your parents. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? But really, what kind of father tells his little boy, Santa Claus? Are you kidding? Don't be a sap. Santa's just a way to sell toys and make poor kids feel left out. It was such a question as this I found myself anticipating that day, years ago, watching my son in his contemplations. But I soon came to see that George must have a different matter in mind. That is, weighing the pleasure of leaping into the middle of that puddle against the discomfort of wet shoes and the vexation of his mother. He gave the question close study and decided for joy. He went into a crouch, rocking back and forth, fists clenched at his sides, eyes on the water. He gathered himself and jumped. He made a good splash. The water covered his shoes. He stood there a while, then sloshed through the puddle and down the driveway and up the steps to face Anne-Marie. Careful man that I was then, how I admired him. How did we get from that day to this? By what steps did he ascend and I descend? When did this adoring son achieve this goodly height, to look down on his father in a wallow of schoolboy weakness and confusion? Maybe that's purpling it up a bit, but there was a certain adult distance in George's manner that day. Distance and love, and hardest of all to see, pity. This next section I'm going to read takes place when the narrator, who you've just been introduced to, is a student, and he has been in love with a woman named Charlotte. They're both students at Berkeley during the 60s, and he has been unfaithful and is haunted by it, and goes to her room, and that's what this piece is. That evening, I went to Charlotte's room to confess. I recited the lines I'd prepared, but it was hardly necessary. Betrayal was written on my face, in my eyes, the movement of my hands, and I knew it. I could do nothing but watch her read it, take it in, and I saw how her mouth trembled and her own eyes went blind as she struggled to understand what she already knew could not be understood. For what reason could I have for spurning the gift she had made of herself once I had accepted it? She had not imagined I would ever do that. The man who would do that was not the man she had offered herself to. But who was he then? I fell mute, seeing the depth of the wound I had given her. I knew that nothing I could say would reach her now. She was looking at me through a glaze with scouring, almost impersonal curiosity. It was worse than any reproach. Reproach would have been a relief. Yes, and rage a mercy. Then I understood that I had been counting on her to treat me like the fool I wanted to be taken for, to call me names, maybe throw things at me. I'd gone in to play a scene, with myself as the bumbling rogue who's wandered a bit off the straight and narrow, for which he's perfectly willing to take a few good bumps from a rolling pin and be sent to the doghouse, all of course with the understanding that my offense would be thus purged and myself forgiven, welcomed back into loving arms with even greater passion than before. A shallow, safe, conventional melodrama, to be sure, but I already knew how to play it, and I hadn't thought deeply enough to come up with a better one. I was a performer of other people's scripts, after all. I was also a Catholic, at least by well-trained instinct. For many years, the soul I was no longer sure I believed in had moved to the 4/4 rhythm of transgression, confession, absolution, and penance. Even in contemplating transgression, I had somehow allowed for all the steps to follow. The sheepish wait outside the confessional on Friday afternoon with the other boys, the subdued, murmurous voice I would use with the priest. 3 times, Father, 3 or 4, yes, Father, thank you, Father. Then the pressure of the kneeler on my shins as I worked through the prayers he'd assigned me. And at last, the lightness of my steps as I left the church and entered the world, already feeling a tingle of restlessness for the next adventure. And didn't my church love a sinner, after all, a lost sheep? The more lost, the better, as long as he's sorry later. During the ceremony of infant baptism, we in the congregation are asked to renew our own vows by rejecting the glamour of evil. But where did we get the idea that evil is glamorous? Who taught us that sin, though no doubt regrettable, is the prelude to forgiveness, to the celebration of a soul's rescue? that the worse the sin, the bigger the bash. Because isn't that our narrative? Before St. Paul was St. Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, ruthless persecutor of Christians. Knowing the dark, cruel history from which you turned, we hear in his prayers and exhortations an authority we wouldn't grant to some mama's boy who'd sung in the choir, never a drop took, and just couldn't understand why some folks did the things they did. Then there's St. Augustine with his stolen fruit and his mistress, Bunyan's pilgrim, whose journey to salvation would be pretty small beer if it didn't take him through the Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair, the Doubting Castle, and the Valley of Humiliation. Or John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. When he says, a wretch like me, you know he's not just touching a rhetorical base. He'd been a wretch, all right, and then some, a captain of slave ships. And his hymn would not sound the same to us if we didn't know that. The redemption confessionals of our own day have introduced a new, grating note, a tone of swaggering pride in having been such a bad boy or bad girl, with implied congratulations to God for having bagged such a trophy. At least the old wretches really knew they were wretches. Tax collectors, publicans, the prodigal son, the primum exemplum of selfish, lazy wastrels. He abandons his family, leaving father and brother to perform all the work on their farm, blows his patrimony on booze and dice and fast women, and ends up sleeping with the pigs. He has second thoughts, naturally. So he writes home, boo-hoo, and of course his father says, no problem, come back, can't wait. Father stands on a hill overlooking the road so he can catch the first glimpse of his son's return and runs to meet him, then throws a party in his honor, slaughters the fatted calf, that world-famous fatted calf, which we wouldn't even know about if it hadn't been slaughtered for the prodigal. Meanwhile, the hard-working brother, who's never at a party, is feeling the death of 1,000 cuts. And when he finally works up the nerve to say something, he's treated like a crybaby. Get over it, his father tells him. I see your mopey face every day. What's to be excited about? But your brother, that's a different story. He had the gumption to get lost, and now he's found. The lesson has not been lost on the rest of us. Who would you rather be? The grumbling drudge, the virtuous stay-at-home whose steadfastness makes him a bore to the very father he serves? Or the high roller who sees the world from a red convertible, stays on familiar terms with the wine steward, keeps amusing company, gets laid by showgirls, and then, after a few hunger pangs and a brief period of reflection on the error of his ways, comes home to a hero's welcome and veal piccata. This is all by way of saying that I went to Charlotte's room that night, not only to confess, but to be forgiven. I may even have nursed a hope of scoring points for honesty and for being desirable to other women, which would prove that I was with her out of choice rather than necessity. But at the very least, I would be forgiven. That was how it worked. In books, on stage and screen, in my mother's kitchen, in the walnut pews of St. Brendan's. I had never not been forgiven after confessing until this night.
I'm a writer and a huge jazz fan, and not as good as either one of the gentlemen to my left or right in any of it. But I've certainly read, I'm not going to say all your short stories, but I've read pretty much everything you've ever written. And like Tom said, I think everybody of my generation and other people's generations have, and they've been influenced by it and inspired. And I'm going to say, I've heard you play with Marcus Shelby. I've heard you play at Stanford. I've heard you play at SF Jazz. I've heard him play in my living room. He actually was trying to teach my children. As a writer, I got 4 science kids, so we'll jump into that in just a second, because this is what I want to know. But Patrick also has played in my living room, and whenever the sounds got good, I would pause, and I'd be like, that is not my fucking kid. Like, you know, the intellectualism and the sound coming from this cat right here, I mean, he's got a lot to say, and he's saying it, and I hope everybody comes out and sees Patrick as well, as buys Tobias's new Wolff book when it comes out. But deep cats here. This is nice.
Patrick is going to be presenting music with his group at SF Jazz in 5 days, September 18th.
Wow.
It'll be nice. It's these 2 gentlemen. I wanted to acknowledge them too. This is Hans Glauischnig on the bass. All right. And this is one of my actually one of the reasons I moved to California. No offense, Mom and Dad. But I was living in New York and getting a little frustrated with it, and there's a real, the sort of chauvinism in New York about other musical scenes, and I came out to California for a month to try some gigs and dry out a little bit, and and I did some gigs with Hamir, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll live here then. Of course, now he lives in New York, but this is Hamir Atwal. We're really glad to have him here.
Well, so maybe before we dive into fathers and sons, because that's what I'm most interested in, and we only have about 20 minutes, that's kind of an interesting starter question, because so much of the media and stuff and the publishing industry lives in New York, maybe in LA, depending on what you're doing, and vice versa with jazz. The Great Pacific Northwest, having written a novel called Boonville and stuff, definitely, know that stretch of the woods is not necessarily embraced by the publishing industry, nor is, the West Coast sound. And West Coast, I mean, we got 30 million motherfuckers here, right? So, like, who are you talking about? When, right? And is it LA up? And both of you have departed and created your own sounds. You have your own voices, so to speak. So, just a quick, maybe, Patrick, how has that been embraced or not embraced in New York? And then same question in terms of, like, maybe trials and tribulations of having a voice that doesn't come from, say, a media center.
Well, we're lucky in the world of music that there is the artifact. There's the record, which often is the most permanent thing, and hopefully a couple reviews around the record which circulate and that sort of thing. But really, what we do is much more in the moment and with people. The 99.9% of the music I've ever made there's no record of it whatsoever. And the truth is that the recordings, I mean, this goes back to the 1920s when the recording industry was growing in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. The sort of history of music gives this huge bias to the places where the recordings are made and where the critics pay attention. And once you're a jazz musician, I mean, both of these guys travel all around the world, and I'm sure they can attest to this as well. Once you're actually playing and going to different places, you realize that anywhere that there's 20 great musicians and 40 great people to listen to them, you can end up playing some of the best music that's ever been played. And so I've really kind of tried not to worry too much about much beyond that. I mean, I'm lucky that I enjoy doing this so completely that I don't really care much about the rest of it. And I found that in New York, a lot of people cared more about everything else. Punishingly, over and over, conversation after conversation, anxiety after anxiety. And as soon as I left there, I felt really freed to just do this and have it be, this is Tuesday night, and Wednesday night's going to be something else kind of like this, but not exactly this. So I'm happy. I mean, I think we're lucky. We take what we do everywhere. We speak a language, and we can do it anywhere. So we're very lucky in that way. And nobody buys CDs anymore anyway. So.
My Wednesday is going to be exactly like this, which is odd, but can you speak a little to publishing and whether you were embraced or not embraced? And short stories are a different bag, I know.
They are, and I suppose, you know, every writer has a different experience of these things, but I was lucky. I was living in the West and writing short stories, and they started getting published in journals and then magazines, and I never actually had the hankering for life in New York, partly out of, you really made me think of something. When I would go there, and of course I did when I had business there, but there was always a lot of talk about agents and editors and advances and a lot of, I guess, just the business that where I was living and the people that you know, the writers that I knew and lived with, we really didn't talk about that. We really talked a lot about work, you know, stories, novels, that kind of thing. And I was pretty happy to be, I guess, you think, a colonial rather than, you know, a city mouse, if that was the distinction to be made. And I don't actually think there was any advantage to be gained as a writer from living in that milieu and talking that language all the time. Actually, I would have found it demoralizing. Oh, my God, he got a bigger advance than I'll ever get, you know, whatever. And there's a line in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets that I think every artist should have kind of tattooed on their eyelid, and it is this: for us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. For us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business.
You have a brother who wrote too. I remember reading his book Providence, and so I mean, which yeah, and clearly, you know, Providence is not in California or the West Coast. Did he give you any? Was that any sort of influence, or did that make you come closer or further away from any terms of publishing? Or?
My brother is 7.5 years older than I, and he was inspirational to me in the way that, I mean, he loved reading. It was his first passion in writing, and he had, when I was just a boy, he would have me write essays for him, seriously, and he educated me. I wasn't getting educated at school. I got a crash course from my brother, and so it wasn't that I wanted to write the work he was writing. He's very much his own writer, and he's older. We grew up in different parts of the country. He grew up with my father. I grew up with my mother, but that he had a set of values that were, for me, aspirational too, was to write, to you know, to know the literature of your language, to write as honestly, as truly, as well as you can, whatever that is. So in terms of setting that kind of a standard, yeah, he was a model for me. Tom mentioned Raymond Carver. He was a model for me in that way. Not that I wanted to write the stories he was writing, but just to write that well and to maybe have an effect on somebody else with something I wrote that his work was having on me, that kind of thing.
Please, let's do this again as soon as we can, and let's just keep this alive, because this is who we are, not only in San Francisco, but as a culture and as a species. That's what I got.
Thank you, Robert.